Let's talk about three components of the X99 motherboards shown here. I want to talk about the CPU area, the RAM slots, and the chipset. The CPU area is a socket, and this particular socket is LGA 2011. That's LGA 2011. And this is for a bit more higher end motherboards, and it's going to require a Core i7 CPU, which we'll install later in this video series. And you can see here that you have this array of pins. They're actually LANs, and that's why it's known as a land grid array, or LGA 2011. And we'll talk more about that as we move through the CPU installation later on. So anyways, this is where the CPU is going to go, and that's the brain of the computer. That does the bulk of the calculations and processing. To remember the calculations and to remember the data, we use RAM, and the RAM is going to go in these slots here. We have 8 slots, and you can see there's some light gray and some dark gray. And these are set up as banks. There's 4 banks of RAM that we can install, and it's set up as a quad channel system that accepts DDR4 RAM, as you can see here. And the RAM remembers the information that the CPU processes.
Compatibility. Compatibility is key. You need to make sure that your CPU, your RAM, and your motherboard are all compatible. And you want to do this in the planning stage when you're building a computer. Or if you're upgrading a system, you want to check that compatibility first before you order any product or do an installation. So make sure that your CPU, RAM, and motherboard are compatible.
Finally, we have the chipset here. That is the X99 chipset, and that's an Intel chipset that is built onto the motherboard. Essentially, it is the motherboard. This controls many different functions of the motherboard, including connections for SATA, hard drives, and optical drives. It deals with the USB connections here and here, and it deals with PCI by 1 connections, like these expansion slots here, and it deals with a lot of stuff for the motherboard. And historically, this has been known as the South Bridge. But on a motherboard such as this is the chipset. It is the chip for the entire chipset. There is no South Bridge, North Bridge, so to speak. Any North Bridge functionality is built into the CPU once we install that. But this is the chipset itself for an Intel-based board such as this. There you have the 3 main components I wanted to talk about here. The CPU, which is the brains of the operation. And we're going to be using a Core i7 CPU when we do the installation, and it needs to be compatible with this socket, which is LGA 2011. Then we have the RAM slots, and that's for the memory sticks that we're going to install. DDR4 quad channel, and that remembers the calculations and the data that comes from the processor, and it remembers those in the short term, whereas your hard drive will remember them in the long term. And then you have your chipset, which deals with all the connections of the motherboard for things like SATA and USB and so on. So that's those 3 components, and that's the end of this sublesson. Let's talk about expansion bus slots. Your expansion slots are usually located at a 90-degree angle to your RAM slots. And this motherboard is equipped with PCI Express expansion slots and PCI Express only. There's no older PCI slots. If you see a white slot, chances are it's a PCI slot, and that's for older devices, older cards, backward compatibility. But generally on today's motherboards, you're only going to find PCI Express. And generally, you'll find 2 kinds. A long slot, which is a by 16, and a short slot, which is a by 1. The short slot, the by 1, is used for minor devices, network adapters, perhaps a sound card, maybe an SATA adapter card, things that usually would connect through the chipset to do communicating through the rest of the system. So secondary devices connect to this shorter slot, the by 1. And that, on most devices today, is PCI Express version 2, which only allows for so much data transfer. If you want to use more powerful devices, and for example, a video card, you would normally use the longer slot, the by 16 slot. And these by 16 slots connect directly to the CPU. They don't transfer their data to the chipset. They are a very important part of the system, and they transfer a ton of data. So they do that directly through the CPU. And some of these by 16 slots are going to be version 3.0, so they send more data. But sometimes you'll get a by 16 slot that is not, and it's version 2.0. For example, this one is actually a 2.0 slot. This one's a 3.0. This one's a 3.0. This one's a 3.0. Why is that important? Well, if you want to use the most powerful video cards, or if you want to use two video cards working together in, say, an SLI fashion, then you want to make sure you're using a PCI Express version 3 slot. Another example, let's say you want to install a PCI Express hard drive. You'll need one of those coveted PCI Express version 3 slots. So this motherboard comes with 3. This is one of them, this is another, and this is another. And then we have a PCI Express version 2 by 16 slot here, just in case you need an extra one. And you can usually tell because it's next to another one. So you have two, and if there's two next to each other, then you know one is going to be a version 2, one's going to be a version 3.
Make sure that your motherboard has the required slots. This is important for compatibility, but also just for the amount of slots that you might require. You might have a video card, you might have a FireWire card, you might even have a hard drive that you're inserting into these adapter card slots. So make sure you have enough. And you're going to be looking at PCI Express and PCI slots. Most likely, the bulk of them will be PCI Express. The other thing about compatibility is to check PCI Express version 2 versus version 3. Most video cards need to be version 3. And if you're using a PCI Express hard drive, which has solid state technology and is super fast, it has to be a version 3 PCI Express. So make sure that you have the amount of slots that you need for the expansion cards and that you have the right type and that they're compatible.
These slots are usually numbered starting near the RAM slots. So it'll be PCI Express slot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that's common for some of these boards like this to have 6 slots, 2 of which are by 1 slots, and the rest are by 16s. That's common for this type of board that has a 2011 socket and an X99 chipset. So that's a little bit about expansion buses, and we'll talk more about those when we actually install the adapter cards. Now let's talk about the power connectors on the motherboard, starting with the 24-pin ATX power connector. And you can see here, if you look really close, it's labeled EATX power, or PWR. And so that's our 24-pin connector. That's our main power connector that comes from the power supply. Most motherboards also have either a 4-pin or an 8-pin additional power connector for the CPU. And that's labeled as EATX 12 volt. And this particular motherboard has an 8-pin. It requires additional power for that socket 2011 and Core i7 CPU. You also see a connector here for case fan, and you can add fans to your case and plug them into the motherboard. Now, the more things you add, you want to make sure that your power supply is powerful enough, and we'll talk about that more in the power supply lesson. But there's some of the basic connections. The 24-pin main power connection, your secondary CPU connection, in this case an 8-pin, but sometimes can be a 4-pin, and that's your EATX 12 volt, and then also case fans. And now let's talk about the case connectors. Okay, here's our tower case, and we're going to be using this for the AV editor build. And we're going to just zoom in here a little bit. And we have a lot of wires that we're going to have to connect to various places. For example, the case connectors, and here's one example, the power LEDs. That's the power LEDs here. And those are an example of case connectors. We're going to be connecting all of these, the power LED, the power switch, the reset switch, all of that good stuff. All these connectors are going to have to connect somewhere to either the motherboard or to other devices. And here's something else. You see here a fan connector. And we're going to use the fan connector. That's for the back fan on this case that you can see right here. And that's going to connect to the motherboard, giving us some exhaust power for the system. And you can add additional fans if you want as well. And you can sometimes do that at the top of the case, or the back of the case, or the front of the case. Additional fans can help with airflow. If you do add a fan to the front of the case, you want to make sure it's pulling air in. And if you have a fan on the back, you want it to be pushing the air out. And you can figure that out by just using the easy paper test. Put a piece of paper against the fan and see if it's pulling or pushing the paper. So lots of connectors, and let's now show the motherboard and show where these connectors would go. Okay, I rotated the board around a little bit so we could see the case connectors, and we've really zoomed in here. These are the case connectors right here, and you can see some of the names if you look really closely. These are for the power button, the power LED, the hard drive LED, a reset switch, a speaker if you have one that's built into the case, and all these 2-pin or 3-pin, sometimes they have more pins, but usually 2 pins. All these 2-pin connectors connect here, and you generally want the colored wire to go to the plus, to the positive pin, and the other wire goes to the negative. In some cases, you can flip these, but especially for things like the power LED and if you want to see the LEDs work, the colored wire has to go to the plus sign. And, you know, if you're not sure, you can read what's on the motherboard to find out where those connectors are. And also, the best thing to do is to use the manual that came with the motherboard. That'll have a chart that shows exactly what is supposed to be connected where.
Here's a tech tip for you. Read the manual. We call it RTM. Make sure that you read the manual. Whenever you're working with computer components, chances are they came with a manual, and they will tell you exactly what you need to know if you want to find out about those nitty-gritty technical specifications. For example, if you have a motherboard, chances are it came with a manual, an actual physical book. If not, you'll be able to download that documentation from the internet. So make sure you do that. Read the manual.
And so if you don't see your LED lights or the power button isn't working, this is a possible place to look to troubleshoot the problem. Check those case connectors. And you also have connectors for USB, and you have lots of other connectors on this motherboard so that you can connect front panel USB ports directly to the motherboard, so they'll work just like the back panel port cluster USB ports. So there's a little bit about the case connectors.